So it's day one of wearing the Visvim Wabanaki boot, and I gotta say that these are extremely comfortable. So I sized up to a size 12. Typically, I do a size 11 in Visvim releases, but with the laceless style boots, I tend to want to size up because I have a pretty wide foot and an extremely high arch. I kind of regret that because I had some struggles putting these on in the store, but once they were on, they were kind of long. However, like there's no returns, no exchanges and things like that. So other than that, I mean, the materials are extremely nice. I really like the distressing factor that the horsehide has here. The outsole is honestly really interesting. I'm trying to figure out what manufacturer Visvim worked with. I don't think that they're Vibram, but I'll have to double check that. I decided to do the day one of the Wabanaki on the first day where it began to rain in LA. One of the points that I always talk about in my videos is that these boots are kind of meant to be worn and the materials will hold up. You don't really have much to worry about. So kind of staying true to my word when it comes to that. So far, honestly, I want to say that the break-in, there's been virtually none. I don't know if it's because they're slightly big for me, but I haven't had any issues in regards to fit. Like one of the problems I had with the two boot was they were extremely tight, especially in like the toe box area. I was having an issue getting them on as I did with like the two boot, but honestly, once they were on, they fit extremely great. I think that these have a slightly wider opening than the two boot. They do fit pretty true to size when it comes to length. But again, because I have a wide foot and a high arch, I decided to size up to a US 12. I maybe could have got away with getting an 11, and I think that that's probably the route I would recommend for most people, is to stick true to size. But again, it's my first day wearing them. I believe I placed my order like in June or July of 2024. So I'm extremely excited to finally be getting them now. And you know, with this 30-day wear test, I'm just really looking forward to how the leather will age across the next 30 days. Obviously, with the rain and with some of the weather kind of changing here in Los Angeles, I'm excited to see how that might affect some of the distressing. I love the way that my jeans fall in them. However, because the opening of the boot is extremely wide, I think those that typically tend to wear more of a slim or a skinny pant probably won't be able to get the boot in properly. I think that for the most part, I wear 501s and Levi's. I know that a lot of you guys ask those kinds of questions. So typically for bottoms, I wear 501s, which is a pretty like straight fit pant. You can still kind of see the bulkiness of the boot even with a straight fit pant like this one. So I think that if you're going to be going any slimmer than this, you might have issues with the way that they stack with your jeans. But other than that, I mean, day one is in the books, and we'll be keeping track of what the rest of the month looks like. So today is day 5 of wearing the Visvim Wabanaki, and so far it's already becoming one of my favorite boots in my collection. So as already discussed, this boot so far has had minimal break-in. The only point of this boot where I'm experiencing just like a little bit of issues is right here at the forefoot. So there is a little bit of like tightness after my feet have gotten swollen throughout the day, but for the most part, it's still a relatively comfortable boot. When it comes to the heel slippage, I would say more than the two boot, I've been experiencing a lot of it, and I think it's because this like back counter portion is a lot wider than on the two boot. When it comes to the shaft of the boot, as I've already discussed, it's a lot like wider than some of the other Visvim models that I have, and so the overall boot kind of has to be worn with like a baggier pant. For those of you keeping up with the Instagram stories, as you might have seen, I have been wearing these in the rain. It did rain on day 1 and I believe day 2. So it has been raining here in Los Angeles recently, and so the first few days of wearing these, I did wear them in the rain. One issue with the outsole, so because it does have like minimal tread, it is a little bit slippery once you get it wet. It does get a little bit slippery when exposed to water, but that's just, a minor issue to take into consideration. The horsehide of the upper of this boot does make it extremely heavy, and I want to say on day 3, I started to experience fatigue due to the weight of the materials being used here. Being that the outsole isn't like a foam or anything like that, and it's like this leather stacked outsole, it does also add to like the heft of the boot. and it kind of, you know, while it adds to the durability, I would say that overall the boot is extremely heavy. I almost feel like it's heavier than the pound makers that I've shown on this channel, and it also feels a little bit heavier than the Kozaks. And I'm not sure if that's because of the thickness of the materials here, or maybe it's like the outsole or midsole, but it just feels a lot heavier. But with that, one of the positives of being heavier is that it does feel sturdier. Because of the distressing on the upper, it's kind of hard to tell that there's been any wear on my end. All of these markings came with the boot like right out of the box, and so much of the wear that's on this boot wasn't necessarily from me. However, with time, I think that these are probably only going to get more comfortable. Although I think that as the upper loosens a bit, I'm probably going to have an issue with the heel slippage. I think that I possibly could have gone down to an 11 and struggled to initially put on the boot for it to have an overall better fit. However, in the short term, I haven't really experienced much issues with wear. And for reference, guys, so far I've been wearing these a little over like 10 hours a day for the last 5 days. And so they definitely are like seeing a lot of use. But so far, these uppers have held up extremely well. And I'm really looking forward to what the next 25 days will look like. But so far, what do you guys think? Let me know your thoughts on these boots. I've noticed that they've released at a few different overseas retailers already, and I'm not sure when they'll be arriving here in the US, but I know that a lot of you have already reached out to me in regards to wanting to pick up a pair, and so many of you already have. So hopefully this video is out for most of you to be able to assess whether or not you want to purchase a pair before you do. These boots are honestly like, they're really quickly becoming one of my favorites. And one of the other issues that I want to say, or I shouldn't say issues, but one of the things that kind of I'm hesitant towards, so these straps that are kind of meant for you to like pull on the boot and to like make it easier to put on, I don't know if I feel comfortable pulling on these. Like I feel like the stitching on the upper might become undone if I like put too much emphasis on trying to slip on the boots using those straps. I haven't necessarily tried it yet. Typically I put them on with like, you know, this back portion here. I'll like hold on to like the back of the boot and slip it on that way. Another issue that I might have already addressed in my previous video for this boot is the fact that the shaft is kind of deformed and, you know, kind of has taken in this like weird shape because it was like stuffed in a box. I've noticed that the product photos at like Poncho, for example, kind of show the upper like kind of crushed and things like that. So I'm pretty sure that most people are going to receive these with like a slightly deformed upper. Personally, you know, I really don't mind. This upper part of the boot is going to be hidden under pants anyways. I have personally been like stuffing these with like, you know, an old t-shirt just to kind of like give it its shape back, and I think that it's kind of helped. I also think the fact that I've been wearing these boots extremely frequently is giving this upper portion its shape back, but just something to keep in mind. Another question so far that I've been asked pretty frequently about these boots is how they compare to the two boots. And so I think at some point throughout this week, I'll probably be giving you guys a closer look comparing these and the ICT two boots that I have. All right, so we're interrupting the recording schedule. Today's day 6, but something that I noticed yesterday was that with the amount of wear that I've had on these boots in just the last 5 days, the back portion of the outsole is starting to separate a bit. Now, it looks like this is like put together with glue, and so I'm not sure if it's either the quality of the glue or the quality of the overall construction, but I think the fact that these boots are already separating with such minimal wear is kind of a very disappointing part when it comes to this pair. Now, I don't know if that's going to be an issue amongst every Wabanaki going forward, but in this particular release, that seems to be a problem with the outsole that's being used. I wear these boots for somewhere between 8 to 10 hours a day, and you know, so whatever amount of steps that would normally equate to, you know, that's the amount of steps that I've been doing in these. But I think the fact that these are already starting to separate like this just kind of is negatively impacting what otherwise has been a very enjoyable boot so far. Today is day 10 of wearing the Visvim Wabanaki, and so far some of the issues that I've been experiencing have been kind of a letdown. Around day 5, I noticed that the outsole of the boot was starting to experience some premature wear, And on day 6, I decided to make a slight recording of it. I'm not sure if I'll keep that clip in. If I do, then this is kind of going to be redundant, but regardless, I want to show you guys something that's been kind of bothering me. So on the right boot, I've been experiencing a slight separation of the outsole from the heel of the boot, and it's kind of disappointing at this price point. So from my understanding, this is the first time that Visvim has used this version of the outsole, or at least I should say it's kind of like the latest interpretation from what they've been using. Now, I'm still not really quite sure what manufacturer they're working with on this. From what I saw in Slam Jam, I believe they labeled it as like a day-night outsole, but on the Poncho and Lefty website, I believe they labeled it as a Vibram outsole. It's most likely a Vibram outsole, but that's kind of concerning for me because for the most part, Vibram is known to make pretty reliable outsoles. I did have that issue with the G-Patent Skagway that I showed you guys not too long ago, but for the amount of wear that these have gotten so far, it seems extremely premature. Like this happened on like day 5, day 6, which really kind of sucks because like off the jump, I think that this boot was starting to be one of the most popular releases that I've discussed on this channel. On the very first day that I posted a picture of these, I think I might have gotten like 20 to 25 DMs on Instagram, asking about the boot, about sizing and things like that. And so in the community, there was a clear interest to want to buy these. Now, my personal experience with my pair could be a one-off event, and it's probably not going to stop any of you from buying the pairs that you want, because regardless of, something minor like that, it is still a very handsome boot. And, before I had this issue, it was already ranking like top 3 boots that I own. And this is like one of those things where it's like, it's kind of holding it back from being in that number 2 and that number 1 spot. Because all the other releases that I have, they did not suffer anything like that, especially not this early. And the fact that that happened so quickly with these is, like I mentioned earlier, kind of concerning. When it comes to the fit, so a lot of people have been asking me if these are similar to the 2 boots. And I think at this point, I'm probably going to be making a comparison between the 2 pairs. I'm sure I'll record that at a later date and kind of add it in maybe at this point. But while they're both laceless boots, the fit and overall aesthetic is pretty different. So as you guys may already know, the 2 boot is more of an engineer style boot, very reminiscent of the type of boots that were worn by bikers in the 1940s and the 1950s. Obviously, the Marlon Brando reference with the wild one, but these are more of like a roper boot style, which essentially is like, a cowboy boot. And overall, this is probably, like I've already mentioned, like this interpretation of the Wabanaki is probably my favorite so far. And that's why I guess it's disappointing that I'm having an issue with the wear. But when it comes to the fit, a lot of people have been asking me if these are similar to the 2 boot. And I mean, that's a fair question to ask because they're both laceless boots, and we know that the sizing on the 2 boot could be kind of hard to really nail down, especially if you're not able to try them on in stores. And so I realize that if you're not able to try these on in person, you're either going to wonder whether you're going to go true to size or size up. So as I've already mentioned, I typically wear a size 11 in all Visvim releases, except for the 2 boot and the UT Folk. So for this particular pair, I also sized up. And while I'm not experiencing any of like the same pain levels as I did with the 2 boot, those were extremely difficult to kind of break in. These have had some very minor wear, but nothing like there's been no break-in period that has made these like a tough wear, if that makes sense. Like after, for the last 10 days, I've been wearing these roughly, I want to say somewhere between like 7 to 8 hours a day for the most part, at the very least. And so, I walk around, probably 5 to 10,000 steps in these, and there really hasn't been any problem with like any sore points. There are some points though that do end up feeling a little bit tight throughout the day. For example, here on the forefoot, I do experience some slight fatigue, like on the higher part of my foot. There's really no issues in the toe box area. I think that this one's a lot wider than the 2 boot, and when I do that comparison, hopefully it'll be able to be picked up on the camera. When it comes to heel slippage, I think that's probably my biggest issue with the boot. My feet move around a lot in this pair of boots because while the opening is slightly wider than the 2 boot, my high arch and wide foot made it difficult to put on a size 11, practically impossible. And so if I wanted to own this pair, I had to size up. But now that these are kind of like relatively broken in, there's definitely a lot of like wiggle room once my foot is inside of the boot. And so I wish that I could have maybe sized down and just experienced a more painful break-in period and then had a better fitting boot. But that's always going to be an issue with these laceless style boots. Clearly, you can see that the heel has received a lot of wear. That's probably from driving. So the darker portion is where my foot is kind of, constantly rubbing with the carpet of my vehicle, which, is typical. That's nothing too crazy. If you guys have been following my Instagram, on the very first day I decided to wear these, we experienced a rainstorm in Los Angeles, and day 2, and I want to say maybe day 3 and 4, these were basically wet the entire time. It rained on every single one of those days, but I had kind of already said that I was going to start this wear test, and so I thought that, I constantly tell people to wear their boots, so I might as well put them to good use. With that though came another one of the issues. Clearly there's not much traction on this outsole, and that became a problem because I almost slipped and fell, like at least on 4 different occasions. And while, it wasn't necessarily like the most, how would you say, I didn't feel like the most secure wearing these in the rain. Regardless, I still, was like, fuck it. I'm just gonna wear these, and I'll just be careful when I'm walking. But just something to keep in mind, guys, this outsole isn't really meant for like, those type of elements, whether it's rain or snow. Other boots from the Visvim line do offer better traction in those conditions. But as you guys might already be able to tell, besides like the slight darkening of the heel, there's really no wear on these boots. I mean, you do have some like, indigo crocking from like the denim that I wear, but that happens regardless because the leather on here is pretty light. But other than that, there's virtually no signs of wear besides the like pre-distressing that Visvim had on this particular pair of boots. And now taking a look at the left pair, one of the other things that I mentioned in one of my earlier takes on this boot was the fact that this, like, the shaft was kind of like crumbling, and depending on how they stored it, it was kind of like stuffed and it was kind of like deformed a little bit. But now that I've worn it more and I've kind of like, stuffed old t-shirts in it throughout the night, the leather has kind of softened a bit and the shape of it is kind of more true to what I would expect a roper style boot to be. This boot does have less wear in the heel than my other pair, and I don't have any of that separation happening here, so that's a positive note. But other than that, these have been extremely comfortable. One thing to consider though, that issue that I was talking about with like the tightness of the forefoot, that's mostly on my left foot. So hopefully you guys know that as you walk throughout the day and as you kind of like start moving around, your feet tend to swell up, which is why a lot of people recommend trying on shoes like in the middle of the day when your feet are like the widest or whatever. So the experience that I have when it comes to feeling some of like the tightness is on my left pair, and that's on the forefoot here. But other than that, there's really no other issues. I do have the same amount of heel slippage on both pairs. And other than that, these boots have been tanks, which is why, like I said earlier, which is why that outsole separation is extremely depressing, because it's only day 10, but these are already like one of my favorite boots in regards to style, functionality, and overall like leather quality. Like the horsehide on this pair is like super, super thick. And the color is extremely easy to wear, and they're a lot more versatile than I thought they'd be. But I'd be lying to you guys if I didn't express how much that issue is bothering me. Today is day 20 of the Visvim Wabanaki. A few of the things that I've noticed that I might not have already mentioned is the fact that the heel of the boot is starting to darken in a way that I haven't necessarily experienced with other pair of Visvim boots that I own. Another part of this boot that I found to be kind of an annoyance is the fact that because of the heel slip, there's like this like air pocket in the back of my heel, and it creates like a squeaking noise when I walk. Hopefully I'll capture some B-roll kind of showing that, but it's just something that whenever I'm in an area that's relatively quiet, it gets pretty loud and it's like obvious and kind of makes me feel obnoxious a little bit, but that's besides the point. Another thing that I've noticed is that whenever you hit the boot and you clip off some of the leather pieces, it gets a little bit lighter, but that's, standard practice with everything else. So I finally figured out that the soles used here are from Vibram. I read on a few different websites from third-party retailers selling this that they were from like Day Night and things like that, but clearly these are not Day Night outsoles. I just found it to be weird that they didn't brand them with the Vibram logo for this pair, but nonetheless, that's a very minor detail. As I might have already mentioned, these are 360 Goodyear welted, and so they, will be relatively easy to resole should you decide to like swap out the bottom for whatever reason. As I might have already mentioned, the wear experience with these has been great. They're extremely comfortable. The break-in period was essentially like non-existent, I want to say. I really only felt pain for like, maybe a couple hours in the first few days. It was really not that big of a deal. I think that the width of the boot is a lot wider than a two boot, and so it just makes the overall wearing experience a lot easier to transition to. However, if this is your first like laceless boot, the experience is still going to be kind of unique. So I've spoken with a few different people through Instagram and through YouTube about their experience with like the wearability of these. I guess one of the hard things to give you guys advice on, because everyone's foot is so different, is the sizing for these boots. I've spoken to a few different people that have purchased them since I first started recording, and some people were saying stick true to size. I personally went up in the same way that I did with my two boot. As always, the wear experience is kind of unique for everyone. Another part of this boot that I really enjoy is the lack of a Cuban heel. I know that that's kind of become like a Visvim signature as of late, but I like the fact that this is just a regular leather stacked outsole. And while I'm a fan of the durability and like the overall texture provided on horsehide, I am starting to begin to have a little bit of fatigue with the use of the material. Visvim has been using this material for the last few seasons, and it does have its benefits. For one, it's a lot sturdier, and the texture and grain pattern that you get on the leather is second to none. Like a cowhide just won't age the way that this does. The other component that's really unique is the fact that the upper is already distressed. Like I've had these stepped on, people have dropped liquids on them, I myself have spilled like water on them, and they virtually look the same as when I purchased them. Like this type of material with this kind of pattern really just hides any imperfections because it already came with a bunch of imperfections, and so that's a really cool component, especially for like longevity. But one of the things that I have noticed is that while Visvim has definitely improved in some areas, there are a few things with this boot, especially at this price point, that I should critique. So the fact of the matter is that some of the leather on the trim of the boot wasn't clipped correctly, and so it's kind of uneven in the way that it's been cut. You can see some clear like cut marks here and just overall unevenness, which at a boot at this price point, it's kind of like you kind of expect like the best possible like handmade nature. And while I know that it's going to be impossible to make a boot perfect, especially if they're handmade, it's just something that I feel like it's just a quality that I think should be raised a little bit, especially with this type of a release. Some of the stitching is also a little bit loose, which again at this price point, being a full and like unbiased critic, I think that's something they could definitely improve on too. Overall, I kind of am slightly annoyed that the uppers on all the pairs that I've seen are slightly crushed. Some people might like that, but me personally, it kind of like takes away from like the shape of the boot. Mine isn't necessarily too bad, but after a bunch of wears, it's starting to like mold to the way that I personally like have them styled, and so it's not too big of a deal. But I have noticed some that are completely like just like shrunken down or like deformed, and it just kind of makes the boot look a little funky. But when it comes to boots at this price point, I mean, for another roper boot like a John Lofgren, you're essentially almost paying like 80% more than you would for that boot. So for the price of these, you can get two of those. And while I haven't necessarily experienced one of those firsthand, I mean, the quality on this I feel could be slightly better, which is disappointing, like I said, especially if you're spending this kind of money. But with all those negative things mentioned, even then, I still think this is one of the best Visvim releases in the past maybe like 10 years. I personally think it's the best interpretation of the Wabanaki yet, and it's honestly in like my top 3 favorite boots that I own from Visvim, maybe even top 5 items overall. And so looking to close out these last 10 days and see what the wear experiences is like, and continue wearing them moving forward. I've received multiple requests to compare the Wabanaki to the 2 boot, and so rather than go through and answer every single DM, I thought that, you know what, I'll just include it as part of this wear test video. So to my right we have the Wabanaki boot, and then to my left we have the 2 boot. Before I make any crazy comparisons, I want to get a few things out of the way. One, these are an ICT release, so the 2 boot is mud dyed. The upper is also composed of a Belgian vegetable tan cow leather, and so the consistency and texture is going to be a little bit different, as is the break-in and wear experience, so please keep these things in mind. One of the most commonly asked questions from people is whether the sizing is similar or if it's slightly different. So I sized up to a US 12 in both of these boots, but that's because I have a very wide foot with an extremely high arch. So just taking a quick look at both of the boots, you can definitely kind of see some of the different textures on the uppers. Again, the horsehide on the Wabanaki is going to have a lot more grain and texture versus the Belgian cowhide that you have here on the 2 boot. Now, in no way is one leather necessarily, you know, better than the other, I would say. I mean, there's certain durability factors that come with horsehide and things like that. And definitely amongst like engineer boots, a lot of collectors prefer a horsehide version of it. But, you know, it's really a matter of, you know, preference and styling. It's, you know, both boots are going to last you a lifetime. So when it comes to that aspect, like there's obvious difference in like the grain pattern. Also, the toe box of the Wabanaki has this like rough out suede slash, you know, slightly degraded leather on the toe. Although the 2 boot is distressed, it's not due to natural reasons. It's obviously been mud dye treated, and so you kind of had that expedited breakdown of the upper. I bought the same size in the Wabanaki boot as I normally get in 2 boots, but hopefully you guys will be able to see some of the differences here when it comes to sizing. So looking at the toe box, I think once you have these boots next to each other, it's pretty clear to see that the 2 boot has a much more almond shaped toe versus the toe of the Wabanaki. The 2 boot also isn't as wide, and so that would explain why from the beginning I always felt like the break-in period for the Wabanaki wasn't as harsh as it was for the 2 boot. A lot of people also ask me about the height of the shaft of the boot. As you can see, they're pretty comparable. I mean, if I hold them next to each other, like the 2 boot's just a little bit higher, but it's nothing crazy. It's maybe like half an inch of difference, and in some parts, because this isn't like a perfect cutout, it's right about the same height. So just keep that in mind, that the Wabanaki boot is a rather tall boot. When it comes to the opening overall, I think from the back of the boot you'll be able to see it a little bit more. The opening of the Wabanaki is a lot wider than it is in the 2 boot, but what that allows is that, and me personally, I prefer this, what that allows with the 2 boot is you're able to get away with wearing slimmer jeans. Like the bottom of your pant isn't so bulky versus when you wear the Wabanaki. Another thing, so sticking to the opening of the boot, as you can see, one of the reasons why I have an issue with putting them on is because the openings aren't necessarily wide enough for my feet. But looking at the boots from this angle, you can definitely tell that the Wabanaki offers a much wider instep and opening versus the 2 boot. Looking at both of the pairs from the side, you can see the difference in like the instep. You could definitely tell that the Wabanaki has more room in the forefoot, so you're able to get your foot in and slide it a little bit easier than you would with a 2 boot. And I don't necessarily think this is a fair comparison, because the 2 boot that I own has been mud dyed, and typically with mud dyed pairs there is some shrinking due to the treatment of the leather, and so just something to keep in mind with that. One of the things people like about horsehide, in addition to like the grain pattern, is the overall thickness and just like sturdiness. Hopefully on camera it's able to be picked up, but you can clearly see the difference between the thickness of the cowhide used here on the 2 boot versus the horsehide being used on the Wabanaki. And honestly, when I wear the boots, the Wabanaki does feel a bit sturdier. I also appreciate the fact that these boots have this leather stacked midsole and heel versus what the 2 boot has. It's not that I have any issues with Cuban heels, but I kind of got over wearing Visvim boots with that particular style. And so I kind of like the combination of this Vibram outsole with this stacked leather midsole versus the Cuban heel that's used here with the Kneat outsole. I think that the profile of this boot lends itself to be a little bit more chunky, and it also feels a little bit more special when Visvim uses different branded outsoles versus the typical like Kneat outsole that's available on boots and shoes anywhere from like the $200 price point. the bottom of this boot just feels a little bit more special. The other part of the boot that I appreciate is the fact that this midsole has been damaged, treated, and processed. Like, you can see some of the different markings throughout the bottom of this versus the midsole on the 2 boot. The only treatment it has is like the difference in color due to the dye effect. Now, this might sound like I'm kind of shitting on the 2 boot a little bit, and by no means do I intend to do that. It's just to give you guys a realistic idea of what to expect if you already own a pair of 2 boots versus, you know, these Wabanakis. And while, yes, they're both rather tall boots, laceless boots, the wear experience and the overall styling is very different between, you know, this engineer boot style and this roper boot style. For one, the engineer boot fits a lot better, and I have way less heel slip. Even though heel slip does exist on this, I have way less heel slip because this like cup on the heel isn't as wide as it is on the Wabanaki. And on top of that, while it doesn't give you the versatility of like a lace-up boot, this strap does help tie your foot down just a little bit. Like, if you don't get the sizing right with the Wabanaki, your foot could be, you know, flopping all over the place. And for some people, it could be an uncomfortable wearing experience. Me personally, I put on like slightly thicker socks than I normally would, and I experience less heel slip that way. But, you know, again, unless you're going the custom route, these type of boots are never going to fit perfectly. So it just kind of comes with the wear experience. But the problem with that, again, is if you don't get the right size, then you're going to be stuck with a boot that isn't necessarily the best fit for you. My recommendation to remedy this issue would be to purchase from a third-party retailer that you know is pretty good about doing returns, especially with a boot at this price point. And I kind of hate that I always have to mention the price point of these boots, but it's one of those things that we always have to talk about with Visvim. It's obviously not cheap items, and it's something that I myself take into consideration, as I'm sure many of you do as well. I mean, if you got it, then you got it. But, you know, for those of you that are more interested in being a little bit more budget conscious or whatever, it's just some advice for you guys on that end. When it comes to the weight of the boots, the Wabanaki is so much more heavier and just overall denser than the 2 boot. This material feels softer, but the horsehide on the Wabanaki feels sturdier. It's not necessarily like rough in any type of way, but it definitely just feels a lot more substantial. But with that comparison, hopefully that gives you guys an idea of what the wear experience and sizing would be like when it comes to these 2 boots. No pun intended there. But, you know, overall, I want to say so far, if in a perfect world, right, the size of the shaft of the 2 boot, if that was applied to the Wabanaki, I think it would be a much better boot. And while I know I've only owned these for what's been less than a month, I am already starting to appreciate and like them just a little bit more than the 2 boot, if that gives you guys an idea on how high I'd rank these. But with just a couple more days left of this 30-day wear test, you know, I'm looking forward to see any new developments that change. Day 30 of the Visvim Wabanaki boot. So we finally made it to the last day of this wear test, and I gotta say it's been a tremendous experience going through and experiencing these boots in a way that not a lot of people will have the benefit of experiencing. I hope that this guide will either provide you guys with some insight or answer some of the questions that you guys have been asking me throughout the wear test, and hopefully I've covered all those topics between, you know, the first day and the 30th day. But with that being said, I kind of wanted to give some of my final thoughts and takes on this boot. If it isn't already clear, the Wabanaki boot from Spring/Summer 2025 is probably in my top 3 favorite Visvim releases that I personally own. I also believe that this is the best interpretation of the Wabanaki that is released up until this point. There are a few things that have been issues. Again, with laceless boots, you're always going to have a little bit of heel slippage unless you go the custom route. I've gotten relatively used to that experience with the 2 boots, and so I think that this time around it wasn't too bad. However, one of the issues that I'm not too happy with is the separation of the outsole on the right boot. I believe I showed you guys a clip on one of the earlier days when I first noticed that this happened. You can definitely see the separation a lot more clearly now. The rubber on the outsole wasn't thick to begin with, so I can definitely see some of the wear from my driving and walking already. You know, it's already pretty apparent on this pair of boots. The leather portion on the stacked midsole is obviously extremely darker, and that's due to the friction and wear that I've had throughout the wear experience. I personally don't think it's that too big of a deal. For some people, they may not like it, but at least this proves to you guys that I've actually been wearing these boots the last 30 days, and you can clearly see some markings of wear throughout this entire wear test. And I know it's only been 30 days and that true patina comes with time, but this will just give you guys a good understanding of what to expect, at least if you wear them consistently. My overall wear experience with the Wabanaki has been great. There's a few things that, I wish could be altered and changed, but overall I still think it's a great release. For example, I've already mentioned it a million times by this point, but I really wish the shaft of the boot wasn't as bulky. It really places a limit on the amount of denim and pants that I can wear. I like to buy things that I'm able to easily blend into the wardrobe that I already have. When you kind of have to compromise and adjust the items that you wear in order to get away with experiencing like a pair of boot like these, I think that's kind of like, a downfall in a way. You shouldn't really have to adjust your wardrobe to incorporate an item that you want to go with the rest of your wardrobe. When it comes to the material, I've already mentioned this, but the horsehide on this is extremely durable. However, the weight of this boot definitely towards the end, I don't know if it was apparent in my Instagram stories, but I kind of started getting a little bit tired of wearing them, and not because I wasn't enjoying them aesthetically, it's just that they were extremely heavy after wearing them so often, and so I kind of wanted like a break from this style of boot. And a lot of that weight does have to do with the upper. The horsehide used here is extremely heavy, and Visvim has been using this kind of horsehide for the last few seasons, and I'd be lying to you guys if I didn't tell you that I'm starting to experience a little bit of fatigue over the use of this material. Like, I love the way it looks, like, don't get me wrong, but I'm kind of tired of using and wearing this material. I don't know if that makes sense. And not that I don't love the material, right? I don't want that to be like what comes across in the camera, but it's almost like I'm tired of wearing this particular material. Like, I kind of want to be able to experience other, versions of this boot, whether it's like a suede version or something like that. It's just that with the amount of horsehide boots that I already own, I'm starting to experience a little bit of fatigue, and I'm kind of getting over the abundance of this material when it comes to the latest footwear releases. It is a great material. It is something that most people are going to enjoy. The quality on it is great. But again, I'm kind of tired of it in the way that, you'd kind of be tired of going to like the same restaurant every single day. The outsole, I'm not a big fan of. Regardless of whether the heel would have started separating already, I'm not a big fan of this outsole. Like, a lot of the days that I was wearing these, it began to rain, and these things are super slippery. Like, I legit almost ate shit at least a couple of times. And it looks good, like, you have a little bit like of a woodsman heel with like the leather stacked midsole there, and then you have like slight grip here, but it's literally, it's nothing crazy. Clipping on the edges of the leather has been a problem. I've noticed some pretty uneven cuts. Also, the stitch work has been a little bit disappointing on my pair. Like, I don't expect these items to be perfect, and I want to make that clear. Like, I know that there's some people, especially in like the high-end boot space, that expect perfect SPI and absolutely perfect leather, zero wrinkles and things like that. There's people that go to the extreme. I'm not that kind of person. Like, at the end of the day, these are just boots, and not that I don't care about them, but I really could give a fuck if they get distressed. You know what I mean? Like, I wear these like intentionally all the time, and I don't want to necessarily change my personal activities or adjust my lifestyle in order to incorporate an item that at the end of the day is just a pair of boots. And so if I can't wear something the way that I would normally wear it, that it just doesn't make sense for me and my lifestyle. There's things here that aren't perfect, and there's definitely items that another reviewer that perhaps has a little bit more, that's a little bit more detail oriented and things like that than myself, it's something that would probably bother them. But the wear experience with Visvim is an interesting one. And as I've spoken to more people, especially with like the last wear test that I did involving the Kozak, a lot of people were trying to tell me, why didn't you buy a P&W boot? Why didn't you stick with like a brand like John Lofgren and things like that? And as much as I understand the comparison that they're trying to make, Visvim is a completely different wear experience. Yes, to some degree, Visvim is a designer brand, so there's definitely going to be that price markup in regards to just the overall like strategy and role that they play in the zeitgeist or whatever. I don't think anyone makes silhouettes the way Visvim does. And these don't necessarily have to be your favorite, but they are mine, if that makes sense. Like, the way that Visvim looks from like a top-down angle, the way that the boots can kind of just sit on a shelf and look like pieces of artwork, they're by no means perfect, but I think that's intentional. these boots aren't necessarily meant to be a perfect reproduction of a roper style boot, or their engineers aren't necessarily meant to be a perfect interpretation of like the ones that Marlon Brando wore. But what I appreciate about Visvim is that they're able to create their own silhouette where if you spotted a boot, you know what brand it is. And sometimes with a lot of other boots, you can kind of see that they're copying one another and things like that. And when it comes to other boot makers, and again, Visvim isn't solely focused on boots, so let's make that clear. But being that Visvim is able to at least, I want to say, be in the same realm as people that specialize in like boots and that's all they do, I think that it's pretty impressive that Visvim is able to keep up this level of quality, provide this type of a silhouette and overall like aesthetic, while still being able to compete with brands that literally only specialize in boots. You know, Visvim's a ready to wear brand, and you know, this isn't the only thing they're focused on. Like there's some seasons where I really prefer the shirting or I prefer the jackets. But this particular pair, like I really love the silhouette of this Wabanaki. And I think that while again, Visvim doesn't always do everything perfectly and not everything is going to be, you know, at the utmost, you know, tier of quality that you would expect, I think that this interpretation of the Wabanaki has been one of my favorite boots that I've ever owned. It's probably in the top 5 Visvim items that I've ever owned as well. And I think that's saying a lot. The amount of questions that I've been asked about this boot for the last 30 days, to me kind of shows that the community is relatively interested in these as well. And I think with all that being considered, I think one day these will be seen as a modern classic and a release that just about every Visvim collector will at some point want to own. With all that being said, let me know your thoughts. Did you enjoy the 30-day wear test? I don't know if there's a pair of boots that I already own that you guys want to see me try this out on. These wear tests are definitely an interesting experience because you really get to know the boots. And again, I'm going to reiterate, like it's only 30 days, but I promise you, like most people do not get 30 wears a year out of their boots. So the fact that I'm getting this much wear in such a short amount of time really makes me, you know, really helps me to understand kind of like the sizing and the overall fit and what the longevity of these type of items are going to be. And it also doesn't hurt that I'm kind of getting the cost per wear down already. Thank you all again for continuing to inspire me to make these videos. I really do appreciate all the positive feedback, and I look forward to creating more content for you guys. Until next time, thank you all again for tuning in. Peace.
Give it a little like, can you?